The abandoned asylum still stands at the edge of town, windows shattered, doors chained, and halls swallowed by dust. A group finally crosses the rusted gates with flashlights and cameras, stepping through peeling corridors where old wheelchairs sit frozen in place. Every room looks stripped clean, until they find the basement entrance hidden under warped floorboards. The stairs drop into colder air, the walls narrowing into tunnels packed with rotting files and broken medical machines. Then a locked steel door appears, sealed like someone never wanted it opened again. When it gives way, the first thing they see isn't a room, it's evidence. The asylum had stood abandoned for decades, a grim monument to a forgotten era of medical experimentation and unspeakable horrors. As you approach its dilapidated gates, the chill in the air seems to deepen, and the wind carries with it whispers of a time long past. Its broken windows and rotting walls are the least of the horrors that this place holds within. No one had dared to enter for years, but then one day someone did. And what they found beneath the asylum is a mystery that has haunted the survivors, investigators, and even the most hardened historians to this day. The stories of this forsaken institution have always been shrouded in shadows. Rumors of patients who were never meant to leave, strange experiments conducted under the guise of care, and a series of unexplained disappearances that only seemed to grow over the years. But it wasn't until the discovery of something far worse beneath the asylum's decaying floorboards that the true scale of its dark past began to unravel. The abandoned asylum was once a thriving institution, a place where the mentally ill were brought in hopes of finding some form of relief or cure. It was said to have been founded on the ideals of progressive psychiatry, championed by some of the leading minds of the early 20th century. But as with many institutions of its kind, something went horribly wrong. Patients who entered these doors were not just those with mental illnesses, but sometimes victims of circumstances, those cast aside by a society that didn't know what to do with them. Those who were poor, orphaned, or simply considered different found themselves committed, often with little more than a doctor's note. But none of them ever imagined the true horrors that awaited them inside. Despite its grand beginnings, the asylum quickly became a place of darkness, shrouded in whispers of inhumane treatment and abuse. There were rumors of so-called experimental treatments that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics, treatments that were far more sinister than any prescription or therapy. It was said that the asylum became a laboratory of sorts, where human lives were nothing more than subjects in an experiment. ECT, lobotomies, and other extreme measures were part of the arsenal, but it went beyond that, much further. As the years went by, the asylum's reputation grew darker. Those who worked within its walls were said to have seen strange things, patients who vanished overnight, or those who were left in rooms, alone, with no explanation. Staff members who dared to question the methods used were swiftly dismissed, their words buried beneath a thick layer of silence. And as the story swirled, many of the patients who may have once entered the asylum with hope ended up lost in its labyrinthine halls, never to be seen again. Then, in the early 1970s, the asylum was abandoned without any official explanation. The government, local authorities, and medical professionals all remained eerily silent on the matter. The place was left to rot, its halls now filled with nothing but memories of pain, loss, and sorrow. But the mystery of why it closed so suddenly has remained unsolved. What happened in those final days? Why was this once bustling institution suddenly vacated, its doors bolted shut and its halls left empty? For years, it remained a forgotten relic, a place where curious trespassers would wander, hoping to catch a glimpse of the darkness within. But it wasn't until a group of investigators, led by a local historian, stumbled upon the asylum's basement that the true horror began to unfold. What they discovered beneath the asylum's foundation is something that still haunts them to this day. It wasn't just the remains of forgotten patients or discarded medical equipment. What lay beneath the floor was something far more disturbing. The discovery came about after a tip-off from an anonymous source, claiming that there were things hidden deep below the asylum that no one had ever bothered to investigate. At first, the local authorities dismissed it as another urban legend, another hoax by thrill-seeking adventurers. But the historian, along with a team of researchers and local investigators, decided to take a deeper look. What they uncovered was beyond anything they could have imagined. Beneath the asylum's crumbling structure, hidden in a labyrinth of tunnels and forgotten rooms, they found evidence that pointed to something far darker than simple medical malpractice or unethical treatment. The deeper they dug, the more they found: strange symbols etched into the walls, bizarre medical documents that spoke of long-forgotten procedures, and piles of skeletal remains that didn't seem to belong to the patients who had once roamed its halls. There were also medical records, hundreds of them, tucked away in boxes that had been buried deep in the tunnels. These documents didn't just describe treatments. They outlined something far more disturbing. A secret project, one that had been carried out in the asylum's final years. The project was officially labeled as experimental psychiatric care, but as the investigators read through the records, it became clear that it was something far more sinister. The project seemed to involve a variety of subjects, many of whom were not patients at all. They were members of the general public, those who had been abducted from the streets or taken from their homes without their knowledge. They were subjected to horrific procedures, experiments that were far more terrifying than anything the medical community had ever approved. The team was horrified by what they uncovered. The documents referred to a network of doctors and high-ranking officials who were involved in this project. People who, despite their apparent innocence, had knowingly orchestrated this gruesome series of events. And yet, as much as they uncovered, there were still pieces of the puzzle that remained unsolved. The deeper they dug, the more questions they had. Why was the asylum's final project buried in secrecy? And why, despite all the evidence, had it taken so long for someone to find the truth? But the discovery did not stop there. The team found something even more chilling beneath the asylum. A hidden room, its door sealed tight with what seemed to be an ancient lock. Inside this room they found objects that were even more bizarre. There were ritualistic artifacts, objects that seemed out of place in a psychiatric hospital. Some of them appeared to have been part of some kind of occult ritual. But the most unsettling of all were the remains that had been carefully arranged in patterns, as though placed deliberately. Despite the mounting evidence, the authorities, once again, seemed to turn a blind eye. The local law enforcement was quick to discredit the findings, claiming that the remains could simply be from long-forgotten patients who had passed away decades ago. But this didn't explain the strange rituals, the symbols, or the sinister experiments described in the documents. It was as if the discovery was being covered up, as though someone wanted the truth to remain buried along with the asylum itself. The investigators left with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: the asylum's secrets were far from being fully uncovered. The darkness beneath it was deeper, more insidious than anyone could have imagined. And though they may have unearthed a portion of the asylum's horrifying past, it's likely that the full truth will never come to light. What happened at that asylum? What were they trying to hide? And why are the authorities so determined to keep the answers buried? The answers to these questions still elude us, and as time passes, it seems as though the mystery may never be fully explained. But one thing is certain: the asylum's dark legacy will haunt those who seek the truth for generations to come. The asylum's origins are as murky as its eventual decline. Initially, it was founded as a beacon of hope, a progressive medical facility built with the intention of offering new treatments for those suffering from mental illness. In the early 1900s, psychiatry was undergoing a radical transformation. Institutions like this asylum were designed to be sanctuaries for the afflicted, places where patients could find relief from their conditions, places that promised to understand, treat, and care for those whose minds had broken under the weight of societal expectations and personal struggles. But beneath this hopeful vision, there were dark forces at work, and the institution's true purpose was never as noble as it seemed. The asylum was designed with grand aspirations. Its architects envisioned a sanctuary that would stand apart from the grim, overcrowded institutions of the time. From the outside, the building was a masterpiece of early 20th century design. Tall, imposing, with wide windows and expansive grounds meant to offer the patients an air of freedom and openness. The facade was elegant, almost regal, a stark contrast to the building's eventual descent into chaos. The very design of the asylum was an expression of optimism. Tall columns and open spaces, all meant to convey the idea that the patients who walked through its doors would experience freedom and rehabilitation, not confinement and punishment. But this image was soon shattered by the institution's methods, its hidden practices, and the cruelty that lurked behind the locked doors. In the beginning, the asylum was hailed as a forward-thinking institution, with doctors and staff members promoting ideas that were considered revolutionary for their time. Treatments ranged from physical therapies such as exercise and electrotherapy, to more experimental approaches like hydrotherapy and even early forms of psychotherapy. The asylum's reputation grew, attracting patients from all over the country, many seeking relief from depression, schizophrenia, and other mental disorders. But as more patients were admitted, the asylum quickly began to reveal its darker side. The asylum was run by a medical director, Dr. Edward Lambert, a man whose ambition and desire to prove his theories would soon lead to the institution's fall from grace. Dr. Lambert was charismatic, intelligent, and driven by the belief that mental illness could be treated through innovative, albeit questionable, methods. As more patients filled the asylum, Dr. Lambert pushed the boundaries of what was considered ethical in psychiatric care. He advocated for treatments that were untested and often involved severe, invasive procedures. For him, the human mind was a puzzle to be unlocked, and any means necessary, no matter how extreme, could be justified in the pursuit of understanding. One of the earliest and most notorious treatments used was electroconvulsive therapy (ECT), then in its infancy. While ECT was thought to hold promise for patients suffering from certain types of severe depression, it was often applied recklessly at the asylum. Dr. Lambert used high doses of electricity in ways that pushed the limits of what was safe, sometimes causing patients to suffer permanent physical and psychological damage. The asylum's use of ECT was not just a therapeutic tool, but a form of control. Patients were subjected to it against their will, without consent, often leaving them confused and disoriented. But the abuses went further than just electroshock therapy. As the years passed, Dr. Lambert introduced more unorthodox and controversial treatments. The asylum was transformed into a laboratory for his experiments, where patients were treated like lab rats. Lobotomies became another common procedure, an attempt to cure what Dr. Lambert and his colleagues deemed uncontrollable or unfit minds. While lobotomies were not uncommon in psychiatric institutions at the time, the procedures performed at the asylum were far more extreme. Dr. Lambert's approach was unregulated, and patients were subjected to these procedures without full knowledge of what they entailed or whether they were truly necessary. Many patients were left in a permanent state of mental and physical disability, their personalities and minds forever altered by the invasive surgeries. Over time, the asylum's reputation for progressive treatment became overshadowed by its increasing brutality. Whispers began to spread about patients who seemed to disappear overnight, and others who were left to waste away in solitary confinement. The asylum's dark reputation was further solidified when an anonymous letter surfaced, claiming that Dr. Lambert was experimenting on patients without their consent, using them as subjects for twisted, dangerous trials. The letter was dismissed by the asylum's administration, but the rumors persisted, and the fear among patients grew. Staff members who began to question the treatments were either silenced or quickly fired, and some even disappeared without a trace. The true nature of the asylum began to reveal itself in the 1920s and 1930s. Many of the patients admitted were not simply those suffering from mental illness, but also individuals deemed by society to be undesirable: the poor, the orphaned, and even criminals. This group of vulnerable individuals became the target of Dr. Lambert's experiments. While some patients were there for legitimate treatment, others were abandoned by their families or coerced into being committed. Dr. Lambert's methods were not only brutal, they were exploitative. The asylum became a place where the powerless were subjected to cruel treatments, where people who had nowhere else to go were trapped in a system that saw them as nothing more than subjects for experimentation. As the years wore on, the asylum's capacity to treat patients began to outstrip its resources. The building, once grand and hopeful, was now overcrowded and deteriorating. Patients were packed into rooms in unsanitary conditions, where they were often left to fend for themselves. The asylum's grounds, which had once been a symbol of hope and freedom, became a suffocating prison for those unlucky enough to be committed. The staff, overwhelmed and undertrained, could do little to alleviate the suffering, and the asylum's reputation began to spiral into chaos. As the 1940s approached, the asylum's dark secrets began to leak into the public. Investigations were launched by local authorities, but they were quickly shut down by powerful individuals connected to the asylum's administration. Whistleblowers who tried to expose the truth were silenced, either through intimidation or worse. But despite their best efforts, the public began to take notice. The rumors about the asylum's mistreatment of patients became too loud to ignore. The question on everyone's mind was, what had really been happening behind those walls for all these years? Then, in the 1950s, something unprecedented occurred. The asylum suddenly closed its doors, abandoning all of its patients with little explanation. The government had issued no formal statement, and there was no public notice of its closure. Staff members who had been working there for years were left in the dark. Some said that the decision to close the asylum was made quickly, in response to public outcry, but no one really knew the full story. The asylum's doors were shut, its patients abandoned, and the staff scattered. The truth about the asylum was buried, and it seemed that its dark legacy would remain hidden forever. But even though the asylum was closed, the rumors did not die. For years, locals spoke of strange happenings around the abandoned building. The stories only grew more unsettling with time. The patients who had once walked its halls were gone, but their presence was still felt. Whispers of their suffering, their stories of fear and torment, lingered long after the asylum's final days. The question remained, what had really happened within the walls of that institution? What had been done to the patients who were once held there? The answers were buried deep, locked away in forgotten rooms and rotting archives. The asylum's closure did not mark the end of its story. In fact, it only marked the beginning of a new chapter in a mystery that was far from solved. The final days of the asylum were marked by an eerie sense of urgency and silence. No official statement was ever issued regarding its sudden closure, and the reasons behind the abandonment of such a grand institution remained a subject of speculation for years. Some say the decision was made hastily, triggered by a sudden shift in government policy or mounting public pressure. Others believe the closure was planned long in advance, but shrouded in secrecy to avoid a scandal that could bring down the entire institution. Whatever the true reason, the asylum was abruptly vacated, leaving behind a ghostly shell of its former self. In the aftermath, the silence surrounding the asylum was deafening. Families of patients who had been committed there were left without answers. Some received letters stating that their loved ones had been transferred to other facilities, but no one ever saw them again. Those who had spent years in the asylum, who had been treated, or mistreated, there were simply cast aside. The building was sealed, its doors locked, and its windows boarded up, as if to erase all trace of what had happened inside. The local authorities, once so involved in its operation, now remained conspicuously quiet. No one came forward to explain why the asylum was abandoned so suddenly. For many, it was as though the institution had never existed at all. Over time, the asylum faded into the background of the town's history. It became just another building on the edge of town, its dark past relegated to whispered rumors and ghost stories. But the mystery of its closure never fully disappeared. People who had once worked at the asylum spoke in hushed tones about the strange events that unfolded in the final weeks before the building was abandoned. Former employees, many of whom had spent years there, reported feeling a growing sense of unease in the days leading up to the closure. Some claimed they had been told by their superiors that the institution was under investigation, though no official reports were ever filed. Others spoke of being pressured to leave quickly, without explanation, and without being given time to tie up loose ends. There were even rumors that the staff had been ordered to dispose of records, patient files, treatment notes, and medical reports, so that the true extent of the asylum's practices would never be known. These stories were never proven, but they added another layer of suspicion to an already mysterious situation. The asylum's sudden abandonment felt as if it were part of a larger cover-up, a deliberate attempt to erase its dark history and bury whatever secrets still lingered within its walls. Despite the effort to erase the past, people continued to ask questions. The building stood, empty and decaying, but its shadow loomed large over the community. The asylum had become a symbol of the unknown, an eerie reminder of the lives that had been disrupted, if not destroyed, within its confines. Local residents would sometimes gather in small groups, sharing stories of strange occurrences near the building. Some claimed to have heard eerie sounds emanating from inside the asylum late at night, while others swore they had seen shadows moving behind its boarded-up windows. Whether these stories were fueled by fear, curiosity, or the lingering memories of the asylum's dark past, one thing was certain: the building had left an indelible mark on the town. For years, the asylum remained abandoned, its secrets locked away behind crumbling walls and locked doors. But then, in the early 2000s, something unexpected happened. A group of urban explorers, armed with little more than flashlights and a thirst for adventure, decided to venture into the long-forgotten building. What they discovered inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. The explorers carefully made their way through the decaying structure, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The asylum was a labyrinth of decaying rooms and long-forgotten spaces, each one telling its own story of neglect and decay. As they wandered deeper into the building, they stumbled upon a series of rooms that seemed completely untouched by time. These rooms, hidden away in the lower levels of the asylum, had been sealed off for reasons no one could explain. But it wasn't just the sealed rooms that intrigued the explorers, it was what they found inside. In one of the rooms, they discovered old medical records and patient files, stacked haphazardly on a rotting wooden desk. The records were yellowed with age, but the writing was still legible. As they sifted through the papers, the explorers found something unsettling. The names on the patient lists weren't just of the mentally ill or those who had been admitted for treatment. There were also names of individuals who didn't belong, people who had no history of mental illness, no record of being admitted to the asylum. These were the names of local citizens, many of whom had simply disappeared in recent years. The discovery was chilling. What had happened to these people? Why had they been admitted to the asylum without any formal record? Were they part of some larger experiment, or were they simply victims of a broken system? The explorers had more questions than answers, and the discovery only deepened the mystery of the asylum's true purpose. The more they uncovered, the more it seemed that the asylum had been involved in something far more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. As they moved further into the building, the explorers stumbled upon something even more disturbing: an old, forgotten basement. The door to the basement was locked, but after some effort they managed to force it open. What they found inside was something straight out of a nightmare. The basement was filled with strange equipment, old medical machines, some of them still functional, others long forgotten. But it wasn't just the equipment that caught their attention. It was the sight of hundreds of files and records, each one detailing experiments that had been conducted on patients, experiments that defied all ethical boundaries. The documents revealed a disturbing pattern. The asylum had been conducting experiments on its patients for years, using them as guinea pigs for unapproved medical procedures and treatments. The experiments were designed to test the limits of human endurance, the effects of various drugs, and the impact of invasive surgeries. It was clear that these experiments were not part of any legitimate medical research. They were part of something far darker, something that had been hidden from the public for decades. The discovery was shocking, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Who had authorized these experiments? Why had they been kept secret for so long? And perhaps most disturbingly, why had the asylum's final days been shrouded in such mystery? Was it simply a matter of medical malpractice, or was there something more sinister at play, something that had been buried beneath the asylum's decaying walls for years? The answers to these questions may never be fully known. The asylum's final days remain a mystery, its secrets locked away in the shadows of its abandoned halls. But one thing is certain: whatever happened within those walls was far more than a simple case of medical negligence or historical oversight. It was a cover-up, a deliberate attempt to erase the truth and bury the asylum's dark history forever. And even though the building has been abandoned for decades, its legacy lives on in the unanswered questions and the chilling discoveries that continue to haunt those who dare to uncover the truth. What the investigators found beneath the asylum that day still sends shivers down the spines of those who were part of the team. They had only expected to find remnants of a forgotten past, dusty old papers, abandoned medical equipment, perhaps a few long-forgotten artifacts left behind when the asylum was abruptly closed. But what they uncovered was far more disturbing and far-reaching than anyone had anticipated. The darkness that lay hidden beneath the asylum's crumbling floors was a legacy of unspeakable acts and a history far darker than any of them could have imagined. The moment the investigators descended into the depths of the building, they were struck by the eerie stillness that hung in the air. The sounds of their footsteps echoed against the cold, damp walls, reverberating through the long-forgotten chambers. It felt as though time had frozen in these hidden spaces, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to come and uncover its secrets. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay clung to every surface, seeping into their lungs as they moved deeper into the basement. But it wasn't the physical state of the space that disturbed them the most. It was what lay hidden within. The investigators had received an anonymous tip about the existence of secret rooms beneath the asylum, rooms that had been locked away for years. Some believed it was the final resting place for those who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, while others thought it was a repository for the asylum's darkest secrets, documents, medical records, and perhaps even bodies that had been buried long before the building's closure. The tip led them to believe that there was more to this place than met the eye, that the asylum's history might not be as straightforward as it seemed. As they entered the first of the hidden rooms, the investigators were stunned by what they saw. The room was filled with old medical equipment, some of it archaic, others more advanced but still unfamiliar to most. There were surgical tools that had not been used in decades, strange devices that seemed to defy explanation, and bookshelves lined with medical texts that were long out of date. But it wasn't the equipment that caught their attention. It was what lay in the corner of the room. A small, rusted metal box sat on the floor, half buried beneath a pile of decaying papers. It seemed insignificant at first, just another piece of forgotten debris in a long-abandoned building. But when the investigators opened it, they were met with a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Inside the box were dozens of photographs, faded and yellowed with age, of patients from the asylum, many of them unrecognizable due to their disfigured states. Some of the patients appeared to be in the midst of painful treatments, while others were shown in various stages of medical experimentation. The images were shocking, grotesque, and seemed to suggest that something far darker had been taking place in the asylum than anyone had realized. The investigators continued to search the room, growing more disturbed with each passing moment. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the asylum had been a site of horrific medical experiments. It was not just the unethical treatments that patients had been subjected to, it was the fact that these experiments had been conducted without the patient's consent, without any oversight, and in many cases without any regard for their humanity. The asylum had become a breeding ground for some of the most horrific abuses imaginable, and the evidence was right there, hidden beneath the floors, sealed away for decades. The most disturbing part of their discovery, however, was the series of medical records they found in a locked filing cabinet. These records, much like the photographs, depicted patients who had undergone brutal procedures, lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and other experiments designed to manipulate or erase their memories. But it wasn't just the treatments that were shocking. It was the fact that many of the patients who had been subjected to these procedures were not even mentally ill to begin with. Some were simply poor, homeless, or had been committed for reasons that seemed entirely arbitrary. These patients had been used as test subjects, their bodies and minds manipulated in the name of science, by a group of doctors and administrators who saw them as little more than disposable objects. As the investigators pored over the records, they found that many of the patients had been kept in the asylum for much longer than necessary, their conditions worsened by the very treatments that were supposed to help them. Some had been left in solitary confinement for years, while others had been subjected to experimental drugs, their reactions documented in painstaking detail. The records painted a picture of a facility that was less a hospital and more a prison, a place where the vulnerable were treated as commodities to be experimented on, used, and discarded. But the most chilling discovery came when the investigators uncovered a series of documents detailing the involvement of external organizations. It appeared that the asylum had been working with several government agencies, as well as private medical companies, conducting research that went far beyond anything that could be considered ethical. The documents revealed that the asylum had been part of a covert program, one that involved not just medical experimentation, but psychological manipulation and brainwashing techniques. These experiments, which had been conducted under the guise of psychiatric care, were aimed at testing the limits of human endurance, altering memories, and even controlling the behavior of the subjects. The extent of the program was staggering, and the investigators could hardly believe what they were reading. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that the asylum had been involved in something far more nefarious than anyone had imagined. The experiments had been conducted not just for the sake of science, but for the advancement of a dark and twisted agenda. The asylum had become a place of horrors, where the innocent were subjected to unspeakable acts in the name of progress. And yet, as they dug deeper, the investigators found that the trail of corruption and deception stretched far beyond the asylum itself. The documents they uncovered hinted at a network of powerful individuals and organizations who had been complicit in the asylum's actions, enabling the experiments to continue unchecked for years. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the asylum's dark history had been carefully hidden, its secrets buried beneath layers of lies and deceit. The closure of the asylum was not an accident. It was part of a deliberate effort to erase the evidence of the experiments and prevent the truth from coming to light. But despite the best efforts of those involved, the truth could not be contained forever. The investigators had uncovered the tip of an iceberg, and what lay beneath was far more horrifying than they had ever imagined. Even as they pieced together the fragments of this dark history, the investigators were left with more questions than answers. Who were the men and women responsible for these experiments? What had driven them to carry out such atrocities? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how many other institutions had carried out similar experiments, hidden away from the public eye? As the investigation continued, the answer seemed to slip further out of reach, and the asylum's true legacy remained shrouded in mystery. What had been discovered beneath the asylum was only a fraction of the larger story, a story that had been buried for decades, hidden behind the walls of a crumbling institution. And yet, the legacy of those who had suffered within those walls lives on, a chilling reminder of the horrors that can take place when the vulnerable are left at the mercy of those in power. Theories surrounding the asylum and its dark history began to take shape almost immediately after the first unsettling discoveries were made beneath its floors. As investigators and experts pored over the documents, photographs, and medical records, the scope of what they had uncovered only seemed to widen. There were those who believed that the asylum had been a mere victim of outdated medical practices, its experiments the result of the naive optimism of an earlier time. Others, however, were not so convinced. The more they learned, the clearer it became that there were deeper, more sinister forces at play, forces that had deliberately hidden the truth, obscured the records, and kept the asylum's darkest secrets buried for decades. One of the most prominent theories that emerged was that the asylum's true purpose had never been about curing mental illness, but about conducting covert government experiments. It was clear from the documents that the asylum had been involved in a variety of unethical practices, many of which were far beyond the realm of traditional psychiatric care. The government's involvement was undeniable, as certain files pointed to funding from military and intelligence agencies. Some investigators even suggested that the asylum had been a front for experiments aimed at developing techniques for psychological warfare and mind control. The idea that the asylum had been used for military purposes wasn't as far-fetched as it initially seemed. At the time, the world was embroiled in the Cold War, and both the United States and the Soviet Union were heavily invested in psychological research. The race for technological and psychological superiority led to a number of controversial and secretive programs, many of which involved the use of human test subjects. The documents found beneath the asylum suggested that these kinds of experiments, while hidden from the public eye, were being conducted on a far larger scale than anyone had previously suspected. According to this theory, the patients who had been committed to the asylum weren't simply those suffering from mental illness. They were often individuals who had been chosen for their vulnerability. The asylum had become a place where government officials could conduct experiments with little oversight. The patients, many of whom had been kidnapped from the streets or had disappeared without a trace, were used as pawns in a much larger game. Some had been subjected to mind-altering drugs, while others had been placed under extreme stress in an attempt to break their will. The goal was not to treat or cure, but to manipulate and control. The idea that the asylum's activities were part of a larger government conspiracy was further supported by the discovery of certain documents that referenced a secret project codenamed Operation Lobotomy. This project, it seemed, involved the use of extreme psychological and physical methods to alter the personalities and behaviors of test subjects. The goal was to create a more malleable, controllable population, individuals who could be turned into effective agents for the government's interests. The experiments conducted at the asylum, many of which involved the use of electroshock therapy and lobotomies, were just the beginning. As the documents revealed, the program had evolved into something far more dangerous, with patients subjected to a range of drugs and psychological techniques designed to erase their memories and reprogram their personalities. As more experts examined the findings, another theory emerged, one that suggested the asylum had been involved in occult practices. Some of the symbols found etched into the walls and the strange artifacts discovered in the hidden rooms pointed to the possibility that the asylum's administrators had turned to dark rituals in an attempt to unlock hidden powers of the human mind. The idea that these rituals had been used as part of the asylum's treatment method seemed far-fetched at first, but the more the investigators dug into the history of the asylum, the more they found references to occult practices and symbols that couldn't be easily explained away. One of the most puzzling aspects of this theory was the discovery of a series of ritualistic objects hidden deep within the asylum's basement. These objects, many of which were thought to be part of ancient occult practices, were placed in specific arrangements that suggested some form of ritualistic purpose. Some of the objects were clearly not medical in nature: strange candles, carved stones, and even what appeared to be human bones arranged in specific patterns. There were also references in the medical records to ritual therapy, a term that was never fully explained but seemed to be linked to a series of treatments that involved altered states of consciousness and the use of hallucinogenic substances. Investigators who had studied the occult suggested that the asylum's administrators may have believed that these rituals could unlock hidden potential within the human mind, perhaps even granting them the ability to control or manipulate individuals in ways that were not possible through traditional means. The theory that the asylum had been the site of occult rituals gained further traction when researchers discovered links between the asylum's administration and certain fringe groups known for their involvement in esoteric practices. It seemed that the asylum was not just a medical facility, but a site where dark and dangerous ideas were explored under the guise of psychiatric care. But it wasn't just these wild theories that gained attention. Some experts and historians began to consider a more grounded possibility: that the asylum's experiments were part of a misguided attempt to create a better society. The idea that the asylum's administrators were simply misguided individuals trying to help their patients, albeit through unethical and horrific means, seemed plausible in light of the historical context. The early 20th century had been a time of great experimentation in the field of psychiatry, and many doctors believed that drastic measures were necessary to cure mental illness. While these ideas were clearly flawed and deeply troubling, they were not entirely outside the realm of medical practices at the time. Some argued that the administrators at the asylum were simply products of their time, individuals who genuinely believed that their methods would result in a better, more efficient treatment for mental illness. The use of electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other invasive procedures was considered cutting-edge by many, and doctors like Dr. Lambert were hailed as pioneers in their field. But as time passed and the results of these treatments became clear, patients left in permanent states of disability or mental incapacity, those who had once been considered pioneers became pariahs in the medical community. In the end, the mystery of the asylum seemed to fit into a much larger pattern, one that involved not just medical malpractice, but a deliberate attempt to control and manipulate human beings. Whether it was for government interests, occult practices, or the misguided idealism of a few well-meaning but deeply flawed individuals, the asylum's history was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Theories continued to surface, and new questions emerged with each revelation. The full extent of the asylum's dark legacy remained hidden, its secrets locked away beneath layers of bureaucracy, deception, and silence. Yet, despite the efforts to bury the truth, the asylum's story refused to remain in the past. As more and more investigators and researchers took an interest in its history, the truth began to slip out piece by piece. Each new discovery only added to the mystery, each new theory adding another layer to the asylum's already complex legacy. But the question remained, would the full truth ever be revealed, or would the asylum's dark past remain forever shrouded in mystery? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. The story of the asylum was far from over. The more people tried to uncover its secrets, the more the mystery deepened, and the more chilling the truth became. The eerie silence that had once hung over the asylum in its final years had begun to give way to a new wave of speculation and unease. As more investigators delved into the asylum's history and the disturbing discoveries beneath its crumbling floors, it became increasingly clear that the building's true purpose had been hidden, not just from the public, but from those who had worked there. For decades, the asylum had stood as a symbol of medical progress, its administrators and staff convinced that they were pioneers in the field of mental health care. But the darker reality of what had transpired within its walls was slowly coming to light, and it was more horrific than anyone had imagined. In the years that followed the discovery of the hidden rooms and experimental records, the asylum's name became synonymous with secrecy and corruption. The more that was uncovered, the more unsettling it became. Those who had once walked through its halls, patients and staff alike, began to come forward with their own stories. The survivors, those who had endured the asylum's brutal methods and lived to tell the tale, began to share their accounts, and the truth of what had happened within those walls started to emerge. These survivors became key to understanding the asylum's past, providing first-hand accounts of the horrors they had witnessed and experienced. One of the most chilling stories came from a woman named Clara, who had been a young patient at the asylum in the 1950s. She recalled being committed to the institution after a series of traumatic events in her life, events that were not uncommon for patients at the time. Her parents, unable to deal with her emotional distress, had placed her in the asylum, where she was subjected to a series of experimental treatments. Clara's memories of those years were fragmented, but she vividly remembered the cold, sterile rooms, the feeling of being trapped, and the constant fear of what would happen next. She spoke of the long hours spent in isolation, of the invasive procedures that left her disoriented and terrified. But what haunted her the most were the faces of the other patients, the people who had been forgotten by the world and left to suffer in silence. Clara's story was not unique. Many others, once patients themselves, came forward with similar accounts, stories of being subjected to harsh treatments, of having their bodies and minds manipulated in ways that defied reason. Some spoke of the so-called therapies they had endured, while others recalled the strange, ritualistic practices that had been carried out under the guise of treatment. The survivors spoke of their memories in hushed tones, as if the very act of remembering was too painful, too difficult to confront. But together, their voices painted a picture of a place where human suffering was not only ignored, but actively cultivated in the name of science and progress. As the survivors shared their stories, new revelations about the asylum's practices emerged. Investigators uncovered a series of hidden documents that detailed even more horrific treatments than anyone had previously imagined. These records, carefully buried and hidden away for decades, painted a picture of a facility that was not only negligent but actively cruel. In addition to the lobotomies and electroshock therapy that had already been uncovered, the records revealed the use of experimental drugs, substances that were untested and in many cases, far more dangerous than anything the medical community had ever approved. These drugs, it seemed, were used to induce hallucinatory states in patients, to test the limits of human endurance and to break their wills. The drugs were administered without consent, often in high doses, and the patients who received them were left in a state of confusion and fear. But what was even more disturbing was the discovery that the asylum's administrators had been aware of the dangers of these treatments. The documents revealed that they had been warned by multiple medical professionals and experts about the risks of using untested drugs and performing invasive procedures on patients without proper consent. Despite these warnings, the asylum's leadership chose to ignore the advice and continued to push forward with their experiments. It was clear that the lives of the patients were considered expendable, nothing more than subjects for a twisted experiment that had no regard for their well-being. The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the revelations became. The asylum had not just been a place of medical malpractice, it had been a site of systematic abuse. The patients who entered those doors had not been given treatment. They had been tortured, manipulated, and discarded. The asylum had become a place where the line between medical care and inhumane experimentation had been blurred beyond recognition. And the worst part was that this abuse had been allowed to continue for decades, unchecked and unchallenged, by both the medical community and the authorities. But the story didn't end with the discovery of the asylum's practices. As the investigations continued, a more sinister pattern began to emerge, one that suggested the asylum had been involved in a much larger network of corruption and deception. The asylum, it seemed, was not an isolated case. It was part of a broader system of institutions that were carrying out similar experiments on vulnerable populations. The documents uncovered in the asylum's hidden rooms pointed to connections between the institution and other medical facilities across the country, institutions that had also been involved in questionable experiments, many of which had been buried by the authorities. The asylum was merely one link in a long chain of exploitation and abuse that stretched across the country. One of the most unsettling aspects of the investigation was the discovery of what appeared to be a cover-up, a deliberate attempt to hide the truth from the public. It became clear that the asylum's closure had not been a simple matter of neglect or financial difficulties. It had been a coordinated effort to erase the evidence of its dark history. The authorities, it seemed, had known about the asylum's practices for years but had done little to stop them. Instead, they had quietly allowed the institution to close and its records to be sealed away, ensuring that the truth would never come to light. The asylum's administrators, many of whom had been involved in the experiments, had gone on to lead successful careers, their dark deeds hidden behind layers of bureaucratic red tape. As the investigation uncovered more about the asylum's past, the public began to demand answers. People wanted to know who was responsible for the suffering of the patients, who had allowed these atrocities to continue unchecked for so long. But despite the mounting evidence, the answers were slow to come. The authorities once again turned a blind eye, refusing to acknowledge the full extent of the abuse that had taken place. It seemed that the asylum's legacy, its dark, twisted history, was something that many in power were determined to keep buried. The survivors, however, were not willing to let the story fade into obscurity. They continued to speak out, to share their stories and demand justice. It became clear that the asylum's victims, both those who had lived through the horrors and those who had died within its walls, deserved recognition. The survivors wanted the world to know what had happened there, to ensure that the suffering they had endured was not forgotten. But the journey toward justice was long and difficult. The road was filled with obstacles, legal battles, bureaucratic resistance, and a society that was unwilling to confront the truth. Despite the challenges, the survivors remained steadfast. They were determined to make sure that the asylum's dark past was never forgotten. They fought to have the asylum's records open to the public, to ensure that future generations would know the truth. And slowly over time their voices began to be heard. The asylum's legacy, once buried beneath layers of silence, began to resurface, and the world was forced to confront the horrors that had taken place there. The story of the asylum is a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the fragility of those who are vulnerable. It serves as a testament to the suffering of countless individuals who were subjected to unimaginable horrors in the name of science and progress. And it is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there are those who will fight to ensure that the truth is never forgotten. The asylum may be gone, but its legacy lives on in the voices of those who refuse to let its story fade into history. As the layers of secrecy around the asylum's history began to peel away, it became increasingly clear that its dark legacy was not confined to the walls of the building itself. The asylum's closure, the systematic erasure of its past, and the deliberate efforts to silence those who had been involved all pointed to something much larger at play. In the years following its abandonment, the true extent of the asylum's involvement in government-backed experiments began to unfold. But as the truth started to surface, it became apparent that there were still those who would stop at nothing to ensure that the asylum's most horrifying secrets remained buried. One of the most chilling revelations came when a group of journalists, working independently from law enforcement, managed to uncover a network of individuals who had been complicit in the asylum's brutal practices. Their investigation revealed that the asylum's experiments had been part of a larger, covert government program that spanned multiple states. The program, which had operated under the guise of psychiatric research, involved numerous institutions, not just the asylum in question, but a web of psychiatric hospitals, research facilities, and private medical institutions, all participating in unethical human experimentation. Some of these programs had been operating as early as the 1940s, and they had only grown more secretive and sophisticated with time. The program, known to those involved as Project Mindscape, had been designed to explore the limits of human consciousness and psychological endurance. At the heart of this project was a belief that the human mind could be controlled, manipulated, and reshaped to serve the agendas of those in power. The asylum had been one of the primary testing grounds where patients, often selected for their vulnerability, were subjected to a variety of invasive procedures and mind-altering drugs. It was believed that by controlling the mind, society could be shaped into something more efficient, more obedient, and more easily manipulated. The experiments at the asylum were just one part of a much larger, more disturbing picture. The first clue that pointed to the existence of this covert project came from the discovery of a series of medical journals and classified government documents hidden away in the asylum's abandoned records. These documents detailed a series of experiments involving drug testing, mind control techniques, and the use of extreme psychological stressors to induce behavioral changes in subjects. The documents, some of which were heavily redacted, contained references to various locations across the country where similar experiments were being carried out. It became apparent that the asylum was not an isolated case. These experiments were happening all over the country, and they were being funded and supported by powerful government agencies. One of the most chilling aspects of the project was the use of a drug known as Substance X. This drug, which had been developed in secret by a government-sponsored pharmaceutical company, was designed to manipulate the brain's chemical balance, creating states of heightened anxiety, dissociation, and extreme suggestibility. Patients who were given the drug would experience a range of symptoms, including hallucinations, intense paranoia, and complete memory loss. The goal was to see how far the human mind could be pushed before it broke, to explore the limits of psychological and physical endurance. Many patients who were given Substance X suffered permanent cognitive damage, leaving them with debilitating psychological scars. In addition to the drug trials, the asylum also served as a testing ground for a variety of psychological techniques. One of the most disturbing methods involved the use of sensory deprivation, where patients were placed in isolation for extended periods, deprived of light, sound, and any form of human contact. The experiments aimed to determine how isolation affected the human psyche and whether it could be used to break down a person's sense of self. Many patients who underwent this procedure experienced severe psychological distress, some descending into states of madness, unable to cope with the overwhelming isolation. In some cases, patients were subjected to isolation for months at a time, with no regard for their mental or emotional well-being. The more the journalists uncovered, the clearer it became that the asylum's experiments had been part of a much larger agenda. The tests on human endurance, the use of mind-altering drugs, and the manipulation of psychological states were all part of a grand experiment aimed at creating a new breed of human, one that could be controlled and shaped by those in power. The asylum had not been a place for healing or recovery. It had been a factory for testing the limits of human vulnerability, a place where people were stripped of their autonomy and subjected to unimaginable suffering. As the investigation into Project Mindscape continued, the journalists began to uncover more about the individuals who had been responsible for the asylum's operations. Names began to emerge: doctors, administrators, and government officials who had been complicit in the experiments. Many of these individuals had moved on to prestigious careers in the medical and political fields, their involvement in the asylum's horrors buried deep beneath layers of silence and deception. The more the journalists dug, the more they realized that the asylum was merely a small cog in a much larger machine. A machine that had been operating under the radar for decades, hidden from the public eye. But despite their best efforts, the journalists found themselves up against a wall. The more they uncovered, the more resistance they faced. Their sources began to disappear, their documents were confiscated, and they were repeatedly threatened by powerful individuals who sought to protect the legacy of Project Mindscape. Some of the journalists who had been part of the investigation were forced to go into hiding, their lives at risk as they continued to piece together the truth. It seemed as though the forces that had covered up the asylum's history were still at work, pulling strings from behind the scenes to ensure that the past remained buried. The pressure mounted, and it became clear that the investigation was no longer just about uncovering the truth, it had become a fight for survival. The journalists, once confident that they could bring the story to light, were now battling against an entrenched system that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. But despite the mounting danger, they pressed on, determined to expose the full extent of the asylum's involvement in the government's dark experiments. It wasn't long before the first of the whistleblowers came forward. A former government employee who had been part of the program during its early years reached out to the journalists with a damning confession. He revealed that he had been tasked with overseeing the operations of several institutions, including the asylum, and that he had witnessed firsthand the brutal treatment of patients. He spoke of the pressure placed on staff members to keep quiet, of the threats made to anyone who dared to question the program. He also revealed that many of the higher-ups involved in the program had been aware of the devastating effects the experiments were having on patients but had chosen to look the other way, prioritizing their own agendas over human lives. The whistleblower's testimony was a turning point in the investigation. It provided the journalists with the final piece of the puzzle, and they were finally able to connect the dots between the asylum, the government's covert program, and the powerful individuals who had orchestrated it all. But while the whistleblower's revelations were explosive, they also came at a great cost. The journalist who had been leading the investigation was found dead under suspicious circumstances, and the whistleblower himself vanished without a trace. It was clear that the forces behind the cover-up would stop at nothing to ensure that the truth never came to light. In the end, despite the mounting evidence and the heroic efforts of the journalists and survivors, the full truth of the asylum's involvement in Project Mindscape remained elusive. The government agencies responsible for the experiments were never held accountable, and the asylum's administrators continued to lead successful careers, their dark past buried beneath a veil of silence. But the investigation had done something important. It had sparked a conversation about the ethics of human experimentation, the power of government secrecy, and the need for accountability. The asylum's story, though far from fully understood, had ignited a fire that would continue to burn in the hearts of those who had uncovered its secrets. The fight for justice, for recognition, and for the truth would continue, even as the darkness surrounding the asylum remained ever-present. What had begun as an investigation into the horrific practices of a single institution had turned into a broader reckoning with the ways in which power, secrecy, and manipulation had shaped the lives of so many vulnerable individuals. And though the fight for answers was far from over, one thing was clear: the story of the asylum was far from finished. Its legacy would live on, not just in the twisted history of human experimentation, but in the relentless search for truth and justice. As time passed, the haunting legacy of the asylum continued to cast a long shadow over those who had once been connected to it. For years, the building had stood as a forgotten relic, its eerie, decaying walls holding the secrets of an era that no one wanted to revisit. But now, as the truth began to emerge, the asylum's dark past was no longer something that could be easily ignored. Survivors, journalists, investigators, and even ordinary citizens were all drawn into the search for answers, each determined to uncover what had really happened behind those crumbling walls. Among the many unanswered questions, one that lingered the most was why the asylum's history had been so meticulously erased. It wasn't just the physical abandonment of the building or the silence from the authorities that made the situation so chilling, it was the deliberate attempt to bury the truth. The more the investigation unfolded, the clearer it became that there were powerful forces at play, forces that were deeply invested in keeping the asylum's true purpose a secret. Even after the building had been abandoned and the last patients had been relocated or forgotten, the conspiracy surrounding its closure continued to haunt the investigation. But the search for answers wasn't limited to government officials or high-ranking authorities. The real strength of the investigation came from the survivors, people who had lived through the horrors of the asylum's treatments and had emerged on the other side, scarred but determined to ensure that what happened there was not forgotten. Many of them had never spoken about their experiences before. They had lived their lives in silence, the memories of their time in the asylum buried deep within them, too painful to confront. But now, as the truth began to surface, they felt compelled to speak out, to share what had happened to them and to the countless others who had not been so fortunate. Their stories were heartbreaking. Some spoke of being taken from their homes at a young age, committed to the asylum without ever being told why. They had been labeled as troubled or mentally unstable, with no real understanding of what had happened to them or what the future held. For others, the trauma had started much earlier, in their childhoods or in the moments before they were admitted to the asylum. But regardless of their past, they all shared a common bond, a shared history of suffering, of being subjected to brutal, inhumane treatments that had left them broken. The survivors' testimonies were powerful, not just because of what they had endured, but because of their resilience. Despite the horrors they had faced, many of them had found a way to move on, to rebuild their lives and to find peace. Some had never fully recovered from the damage done to them, but they had learned to live with it, carrying the weight of their experiences as a constant reminder of what they had survived. For others, their recovery was a long and painful process, marked by years of therapy, self-reflection, and the struggle to reclaim their sense of identity. But what struck the investigators most about the survivors' accounts was the shared sense of betrayal they all felt. The asylum had promised them care, healing, and a chance at a better life, but instead, it had subjected them to horrific treatments, leaving them physically and emotionally scarred. They spoke of doctors who had been nothing more than cold, detached figures who saw them as little more than experiments, of staff members who had turned a blind eye to the suffering around them, and of a system that had failed them at every turn. The survivors spoke of the trauma they had experienced, not just from the physical treatments they had endured, but from the emotional and psychological toll of being labeled as less than human. The survivors' voices became a rallying cry for those still searching for the truth. As their testimonies began to gain traction, more and more people started to ask questions. Why had the asylum been allowed to continue its practices for so long? Why had the government failed to intervene? And why had so many individuals who had once been seen as pillars of their community turned a blind eye to the atrocities taking place within the asylum's walls?